be seated. If you want to turn your Bibles to John chapter 15. John chapter 15 is where we're going to be looking at for our lesson today. Appreciate the songs by Kwaku this morning. A couple of those that we sung at the beginning were ones that I don't know if we've sung here before, or at least ones that I hadn't sung before. But I appreciate him calling us into the presence of the Comforter and calling us back to prayer, back to the Lord. That's a big part of what we're here to do today, is to be in the presence of God and to remind each other even of things as simple but as important as the necessity of prayer. What we're going to be doing today is another theme lesson. So we've been going through a series of lessons this year, mostly on the first Sunday of the month, whenever Blake and I can arrange for it to work out that way. Talking about our theme for this year, which is Abide in Me and Bear Much Fruit, which is pulled from the key text that we're looking at here in John 15. I'll read the verse that we're going to be looking at here from John 15 here in just a second, but just to remind you of some of the things that we've talked about so far this year as we've gone through this lesson, at these series of lessons. We've really been trying to just kind of piece by piece start to unpack some of the things that Jesus says here in the text. We've talked about things like how Jesus is the one true vine and we are the branches. That's kind of the purpose of this illustration that's up here on the screen behind the words, is to demonstrate how Jesus is this one true vine that we are supposed to be connected to, and how we are the branches that are coming off of that, and how we are supposed to bear fruit, as Jesus says here. We've talked some about what it means to abide in him, and how apart from Jesus, we can do nothing, as he says here in John 15. We've also looked at the imagery that Jesus tells us here about how the Father is the vine dresser, and how the Father has this responsibility he's tending and caring for the vine, and sometimes that even involves pruning, right? Sometimes that might even be a painful type of pruning, as Jesus talks about here in John 15. We've also talked about how a big part of how we abide in Jesus is through his word, taking up residence in our hearts. And we talked some in the last lesson that Blake gave last month about how prayer is actually the proof of our connection to the vine. So a lot of the things that we've focused on in the first half of this year have been very abiding focused, I would say. We've been, like I said, talking about what it means to abide, these avenues of how we can learn to abide more deeply in both the Word and in prayer. But a lot of what we're going to talk about throughout the rest of this year is going to be shifting towards another key concept, and really I think a big part of what we're trying to talk about this year, and that is the idea of bearing fruit. We're going to be talking about what fruit is, what it looks like, how Jesus grows it in us, and some of the things that he's going to say even throughout the rest of this passage here in John 15. But before we talk more throughout the rest of this year about what bearing fruit actually looks like, what I want to do is I want to stop and ask a question that I hope will kind of undergird the way that we think about what it means to bear much fruit, like Jesus says here in John 15. And that is, why should I care about bearing fruit at all? Why is this even something that's important for the life of a Christian? I think that Jesus gives us an answer to this question here in John chapter 15 and verse 8. Look with me at John 15, verse 8. Jesus says here, "By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit and so prove to be my disciples." I think what Jesus is telling us here is that the fruit that we bear through our connection to Jesus, through our abiding in the vine, is something that actually accomplishes something, right? This isn't just a bonus, for Christians that are really successful or really fruitful. There's actually something that's being accomplished when we bear fruit. There is something greater than just what is within us. The fruit that we bear is supposed to say something both to others about who we are following, really, Jesus says here, but ultimately the fruit that we bear has the purpose of glorifying the Father. And what I want to suggest is, the point that I want to make this morning is that when if we don't get this settled now, if we don't understand this now at the very beginning of starting to look more deeply at what it looks like to bear fruit, then I think that everything else we're going to talk about the rest of this year could kind of start to get off focus, right? If I don't understand how my fruit glorifies God, then I'm going to end up bearing it for some other reason, right? I'm going to do it to look impressive or to be successful, or maybe even to try to prove that I'm enough before God or before other people. And the fruit that Jesus describes here is just not the kind of fruit that grows well in that kind of soil, a soil that is self-focused. So today I want to lay some foundations in some ways. Before we look more deeply again at what it means to bear fruit, how we can bear fruit, some of the things that Jesus is going to talk about in more detail throughout the rest of this passage in John 15, I think we need to start with the why. We need to start with why we bear fruit and what is accomplished when we bear fruit. And so to get there, there's only two questions that I want us to answer today, and I hope that if we answer these, that we'll have a better idea for why we bear fruit and why this is so important after all. The first one is, what does God's glory actually mean? So if Jesus says that it is through our bearing fruit that God is glorified, what does it actually mean that God is glorified? What does God's glory actually mean? I think we all have probably heard this phrase a lot before, the idea of God's glory. It's something that's talked about a lot in these types of settings and in churches, right? But what if someone asked you, what does the glory of God actually mean? Could you explain that concept? And this really serves as the foundation for the second question that I want to go through that ties more deeply back to the text that we're looking at here in John 15 and verse 8. And that is, how does the fruit that we produce actually glorify God? How does it result in the Father being glorified? I think if we answer these two questions, I hope that we'll be able to understand, again, a little bit more about the motivation for why it is so important for us to bear fruit. And again, I hope that this will hopefully undergird and serve as a bit of a foundation for the rest of the things we talk about this year when it comes to bearing fruit. So let's start by looking at this first question here. What is God's glory in the first place? Now, I'll be honest with you, the Bible has a lot to say about this topic. As I was preparing for this lesson, I realized just how much the Bible has to say. There's a lot of different places that you could go. But what I want to do is I want to take us to one specific encounter back in the book of Exodus, actually, that I think sets up this concept maybe better than anywhere else. And it's a conversation between God and Moses that we see recorded in Exodus 33 and 34. So here's the situation. Moses is up on the mountain. He's been carrying this impossible job of leading God's people through the wilderness, out of the land of Egypt. And in this moment here in Exodus 33, he's pleading with God to remain with the people, to keep his presence among them. He's pleading with him for help. And in the middle of that, Moses makes this really bold request. Maybe a bolder request than anyone has ever made to God before. Look at what he asks here. He says in Exodus 33 and verse 18, Moses said, "Please show me your glory." I think that the only thing maybe more shocking than this request that Moses makes is what God's answer is, right? God says yes. Not a complete yes, of course. God tells Moses, hey, you can't see my face and live. And so God says that he will shield him in the cleft of a rock and let him pass by, let him only see really his back, he says later in Exodus 33. But let's continue reading in Exodus 34 to see what actually happens when God does show or reveal his glory to Moses. In Exodus 34, verses 5 through 7, it says, "The Lord descended in a cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of the Lord. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, 'The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty.'" So this is what it looks like for God to reveal his glory to Moses, to show his glory to Moses like Moses asked for here in the book of Exodus. But did you notice what Moses focuses on when he reveals what happened in this encounter with God here? What Moses tells us isn't a description of the bright light that he saw. He doesn't describe a face or a form or a color. What Moses describes for us here is words. It's this proclamation that God gives as he passes by. God passes by, and Moses doesn't walk away with a picture. He walks away with a list, right? A list of qualities, a list of who God is. Things like that God is merciful and gracious and slow to anger, overflowing with steadfast love and faithfulness, forgiving, and yet in the same breath, someone who will by no means clear the guilty. Here's what I want us to take from this interaction that God has with Moses here. When God shows Moses his glory, he doesn't put on this amazing light show that I think we would oftentimes think about when it comes to the idea of God's glory. What God shows Moses when he reveals himself to him here in Exodus is his character. God's glory is not mainly about what he is, right? God's glory is more so about who he is. That's how God chooses to reveal his glory to Moses here. I think, again, we tend to imagine God's glory as like this like special effect. Fireworks going off, there's brightness, there's a glow, there's something visual that just overwhelms you. And don't get me wrong, there is a visual aspect to what God is revealing here. There's this cloud, there's this radiance that is described. But that's the outside of the box, right? That's the wrapper. What is the real gift is what's inside, and that's the revelation of God's character that he gives to Moses here. So here's our first answer to this question of how we define God's glory, the thing that's going to build everything else, and we're going to tie back to what Jesus says in John 15. God's glory is his divine attributes being put on display. It's God shining forth his character, the things about him that make him God, right? The things about him that are godlike. Something that we can see and is clearly demonstrated, yes, but even more, something that we can know, something that we can hear, something that we can name. What God is revealing here is who he is on God on full display. So I think this raises a pretty obvious question for me, at least. If God's glory is the full display of his character, the whole radiant weight and power of everything that he is, as he's revealing to Moses here, then is there anywhere that we get to see that picture completely? Again, not a portion, not just his back, like Moses saw here in Exodus, not from inside the crack in the rock, but the whole of it, all of God revealed in focus. I think that everything we just said about God's glory, all these beautiful attributes of God that we see listed here in Exodus, the New Testament takes all of those and points them and focuses them in one person. And no surprise, that person is Jesus, right? Go back to John's gospel with me. We're going to look at a couple of things here that I think give us a little bit of an idea for how Jesus is this perfect fulfillment of God's glory. Look at how John opens his gospel here in John chapter 1, verses 14 and 18. Again, this is the opening of this gospel that's connected to this same passage we've been looking at in John 15. And John says here, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. No one has ever seen God. God, the only Son, who is at the Father's side, he has made him known." Do you see what John is doing here? Moses was begging, asking God, please show me your glory. And he got that. He got a glimpse from the back while he was hidden in the rock. And he heard these beautiful qualities listed about God that he says there in Exodus. But John says at the beginning of his gospel, we have seen his glory, right? The thing that Moses was aching for, that he was desiring for, John says this happened in a person who was walking around right in front of him, right? And look at the words that he uses to describe this glory here, right? He says full of grace and truth. That's Exodus 34 language. He says things like steadfast love and faithfulness. John is pointing at Jesus and saying, that God that Moses experienced on the mountain, here he is, and he's here in the flesh. We have seen his glory. I think there's another moment later in John's gospel that actually makes this maybe even more plain for us. In John 14, one of Jesus' own disciples, Philip, says to him, "Lord, show us the Father, and it is enough for us." Do you hear Moses in that, right? He's saying, show us, show me the Father. He has that same desire that Moses has. And how does Jesus answer him? He says, "Have I been with you so long, and you still do not know me? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father." Again, Moses just got the back of God from the inside of the crack in the rock. Philip, on the other hand, is sitting across the dinner table from God himself, from the glory of God itself. And he nearly misses it, right? He can't see what's right in front of his face. Again, this isn't just a portion or just a glimpse of the Father, but this is the Father himself in the flesh. If you have seen me, you have seen the Father. So, if you have ever wanted to see God's glory, here's the answer that Scripture keeps pointing us back to. Look at Jesus. Every attribute that is on that list in Exodus, this mercy, this grace, patience, love, faithfulness, justice, it's all focused and concentrated in one human life. Jesus is the full embodiment of God's glory. And here's the most important thing, the thing that I want us to pay attention to here. Where do we see that glory demonstrated most clearly? In John 13 and verse 31, merely just a couple of hours before going to the cross, Jesus says, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him." Jesus is telling us here that glorifying the Father was the whole reason that he came, right? This was why he came, to glorify the Father. And that purpose that he had, this purpose of glorifying the Father, was what ultimately carried him to the cross. What I want to suggest is that the cross is where all of God's attributes get demonstrated most clearly and most perfectly. Remember that list of attributes that we read through in Exodus? And maybe even some apparent conflict in those, right? We hear that God is merciful, but yet he's also visiting iniquity on generations to come. How can God be both merciful and just at the same time, forgiving sin and yet by no means clearing the guilty? I think that the cross is the answer to that, right? There, God doesn't just clear the guilty by pretending that the guilt isn't there, right? The guilt is named, and it is paid in full. There at the cross, justice is completely satisfied. God is seen and demonstrated as merciful because the one who pays the price is God himself through the sacrifice of his Son. Mercy and justice in the cross are poured out in the same act, at the same moment, on that same hill of Calvary. So whatever attribute of God's glory that you want to see demonstrated, go to the cross. His justice, go to the cross. His mercy, we go to the cross. His love and his holiness and his faithfulness, we go to the cross. Moses asked to see God's glory in Exodus 33, and he got a glimpse from behind it. He heard some amazing things about God. What we have the privilege of doing when we look at Jesus, when we look at the cross, is that we get to stand at the foot of the cross and see it fully, and see it perfectly there in the face of Jesus. So I hope that in some way this helps answer this first question of what God's glory actually is. God's glory is who he is, and that glory is displayed perfectly in Jesus and concentrated most fully at the cross. Which brings me to the second question that I want to address, which again gets back to how all this has to do with bearing fruit from John 15 and verse 8. How could the fruit that you and I produce in our lives, how could the way that we live our lives and that we are produced because of our connection to Jesus, how could that ever glorify a God like this? A God whose glory is already perfect, already complete, and already fully displayed at the cross. How could anything that you and I ever do glorify this God? Now, I do have to be honest with you as we start to answer this question. We can't add anything to God's glory, right? You can't make something that is perfect more perfect, right? You can't improve on perfection, right? Nothing you can do on your best day would make God 1 ounce more glorious than he already is. So I think when the Bible talks about us glorifying the Father through our fruit, through the way that we live our lives, I think that it means something else. There's a couple of different ways that you could talk about glorifying God from the way that the Scriptures talk about it. But for the sake of time this morning, I'm really just going to concentrate on one, and one that I think really has to do closely with what's talked about here in our key text in John 15. So to understand how the fruit that we produce in our lives can glorify God, I want to take us all the way back to the beginning. Look with me at Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. In Genesis 1 verse 26, it says, this is just after the creation account when the world is being made and God makes man. And he says in Genesis 1 and 26, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness." Out of everything God made, only one creature was made in his image, right? There was only one that was built to be a mirror, to reflect some of God's image. Because that's what an image is, right? It's a reflection of the original. It's a reflection of what it is pointing back to. So hear this, and I think this may be one of the more important points in this entire lesson that I want to get across to you today. You were created to reflect God's glory. A simpler way of saying that might be, you exist to glorify God. This is not just like a hobby. This is not just an activity that we try to do when we're here together on Sundays. Glorifying God is the very reason that you and I exist in the first place. This is the reason that we were created. You are a mirror. You're built to catch the character of God, to take in his likeness, and to throw it back into the world so the people around you can see what he is like. Now, I'll be the first to say, I haven't done this well, right? I have not imaged God and reflected his glory very well in my life. And I think that's obvious. That's honestly the simplest way to understand what sin is, right? Sin is the mirror that we are supposed to be reflecting the image of God that we are created with. in reflecting the wrong image instead, reflecting the things that it's not supposed to. When I'm impatient, when I'm cruel, when I lie, I'm not just like breaking some rule that God arbitrarily set. What I'm doing is I'm actually showing the world a false picture of who God is. Romans 3:23 expresses this really well when it says that we've all fallen short of the glory of God, right? We were made to reflect him. We were made to reflect his glory. And I think a lot of us can say, or all of us can say, as Romans 3:23 says, that we've spent our lives doing everything but that. Which is exactly why the rest of this comes down to a really practical question. If I were made to reflect God and bearing fruit is how we do it, what does that actually look like on a random day of the week, right? How can I actually accurately reflect the image of God? I think a lot of times we have this tendency to divide our life into a couple of different categories, right? Maybe we have like the spiritual stuff, like all the things we talk about in church, going to church, prayer, reading your Bible. These are all the things that glorify God. And then there's like the everything else pile, right? There's the the commute to work, your job, your laundry, the tough conversation you have to have with a family member. And I think a lot of times, at least I feel this way, I oftentimes assume that God is not very interested in this pile over here, right? As long as I'm doing the things that I'm supposed to do in the glorifying God pile, then that's okay, and the rest of my life doesn't really matter. But if reflecting God means reflecting his character, then there is no corner of our life where that can't happen. This is supposed to be something that is all-consuming. I'm going to walk through a couple of different areas where we could bear fruit or where we could image God correctly in a couple of different areas, just to kind of demonstrate how all-encompassing this is supposed to be. Let's start with maybe one that you would expect, the idea of encouragement. Maybe this is a little bit in that glorifying God bucket on this side. In Romans 15, Paul calls God the God of endurance and encouragement. And then he turns around and he tells the Romans here in Romans 15 to welcome one another, to build each other up, and to do this all for the glory of God. So whenever you just send somebody a text that they needed to hear, whenever you sit with someone who's coming apart and you refuse to leave them, whenever you encourage someone, you're not just doing that because that's what God wants you to do and you need to obey God. You're doing that because you're reflecting the God who encourages his people and who helps them endure. You're doing that for God's glory. But now let's get into maybe the part of this that we wouldn't as clearly expect, right? Maybe our work is one of the things we would think about. Paul writes to the Colossians, some of which we know were slaves, again, among the lowest of society in that day, and says, whatever you do, work heartily, as for the Lord and not for men. Whatever you do in your work. That means the spreadsheet. That means the sales call. That means the diapers that you're changing, the kitchen that you're cleaning, the job that no one is ever going to thank you for. Whatever you're doing, when you do it with integrity, you do it with excellence, you're doing it as unto the Lord. And you're reflecting a God who is faithful, a God who finishes what he starts, a God who is perfect in the work that he has done. I think a lot of times I have thought about work as something that is very separate from my spiritual life. It's a bit of an awkward thing for the job I'm in now. Can't really do that anymore. But for a lot of us, right, there's a very easy tendency to feel like, hey, I've got my 40 hours of work time. This is not something that's a spiritual activity. Paul pushes back on that here and says in Colossians that even our work is to be done as unto the Lord. Let's move on to look at another one, even in marriage, right? Paul says in Ephesians that the way a husband and a wife love each other is meant to put the love of Christ for the church on display, right? So that patience that you extend towards your spouse when you'd rather be right, or that forgiveness that you have to offer for the 100th time, or that covenant that you keep on the ordinary, basic days whenever the feelings that you have aren't there. All of that reflects a God who keeps his covenant with his people who are breaking it constantly. You are glorifying God through the way that you honor and love your spouse in your marriage. And then here's maybe the hardest one, maybe the hardest way that we might think about having to glorify God in the way that we bear fruit. Suffering, right? Peter says in 1 Peter 4 and verse 16 that if you suffer as a Christian, you shouldn't be ashamed, but rather that you should glorify God in it. Sit with that for a second, right? How can we glorify God in suffering? What Peter's telling us here is that there's a way that we can walk through whatever painful diagnosis, whatever loss, whatever season of life that just doesn't make any sense to us. And we can actually reflect God to everyone who is watching us go through that season of suffering. Again, not by pretending that it doesn't hurt, not by pretending that these things don't matter, but when the world sees someone suffer with hope instead of with despair, with trust instead of bitterness, then they're seeing something that they can't explain, right? They're seeing a reflection of God, a God who is faithful all throughout suffering, all throughout the dark and hard times that we go through. Do you see what's happening across all of these examples here? You know, I could stand up here and probably go on for a whole other hour. I'm not going to do that, but I could keep going about all the different areas of life where they feel like just ordinary life things, right? But we are called, even through what the scriptures say here, to glorify God in these things. I think Paul makes a point that really kind of encompasses all of this. In 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 31, he says, "So whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do all to the glory of God." Paul says eat or drink, right? He's reaching for two of the most mundane, ordinary, everyday things that we do in our life, right? And he says even in those things, there's a way that you can glorify God. Even a couple chapters earlier in 1 Corinthians, Paul puts it even more bluntly where he says, "You are not your own. You were bought with a price, so glorify God in your body." Paul's saying is that all of our lives are to glorify God. Every square inch of our ordinary lives are supposed to glorify God. So I think this brings up a really important point about a really important question that I think believers of Jesus, followers of him, should be asking ourselves. Whenever we have a decision to make about how we spend our time, what we do with our lives, the kind of fruit that we're going to bear. Not just is this allowed, not just is this a sin, or is God going to be upset with me about this, but can I do this for the glory of God? Can I take this job? Can I enter this relationship? Can I spend this money? Can I spend this evening in a way that is going to accurately reflect God's character while I'm doing it? I think that if we ask ourselves this question whenever we're faced with the myriad of decisions that we're faced with on a daily basis about how to live our lives and the kind of fruit that we're going to bear in our lives, I think it changes things a bit for us, right? It changes how you handle that promotion that you're offered at work. Changes how you argue, or not argue, but disagree with your spouse, how you spend the last hour of your night before you go to bed. If this is the question that we're asking ourselves, how can I do this for the glory of God? It changes a lot of things for us, right? But I think there's also a warning here in this text as well. I think the world a lot of times has its own version of bearing fruit, and again, from the outside, it might look almost identical to what we think of as bearing fruit. It says things like be productive, build something, do it in a way though that's going to make you look impressive and successful and enough. The same activity, again, this bearing fruit that we've been talking about, but with a completely different root than what Jesus is talking about here. And like we said back at the beginning, I think that's why this is so important for us to talk about the idea of how our fruit is supposed to glorify God, because the kind of fruit that Jesus wants to bear, it doesn't grow in the kind of soil that's focused on me being glorified. The moment that my fruit is about making much of me, it stops reflecting God, and rather we become a mirror that is turned to face itself. We're no longer reflecting the glory of God anymore. Which brings us back to where our text began here in John 15 and verse 8. John says, "By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples." We haven't really talked much about those last words in this verse, "so prove to be my disciples." I think what this tells us here is that this fruit is meant to be seen, right? Jesus says nearly the same thing just 2 chapters earlier in John 13 and verse 35, where he says, "By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So here's the difference between the kind of fruit that Jesus wants us to bear and the kind of fruit that the world often convinces us that we need to bear. The point of the visible fruit that's being born here is not ever to prove how good you are. It's to show whose you are. Our fruit is meant to be seen, but it is not meant to be for our glory. Not that people walk away impressed with us, but rather that they catch a glimpse of who you belong to, right? Whose image you're reflecting. A disciple is simply someone who is being shaped into the likeness of their master, and that fruit is the evidence that the shaping is actually happening in the first place. Here's the key point that I want you to take home from this first question, or the second question that we've looked at here. You were made to reflect the glory of God. In Jesus, we are restored to do exactly that, right? And so, whatever we do this week, in whatever area we are, in the most ordinary, mundane moments of life, do it as a mirror. Do it as someone who is looking to reflect the glory of God. And when we do this, all that are around us are going to see a glimpse of God's glory. They're going to see who we are following. As we close, I want to leave us with a picture that actually goes back to what I talked about in Exodus 33 and 34. There's actually a part of this story back in Exodus that I left out that is maybe the most famous or memorable part of that story. Read with me in Exodus 34, verses 29 through 33. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand as he came down from the mountain, Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because he had been talking with God. Aaron and all the people saw Moses, and behold, the skin of his face shone, and they were afraid to come near him. And then skipping down to verse 33. And when Moses had finished speaking with them, he put a veil over his face. We see here that after God passes by and proclaims his name, he reveals this great glory to Moses here, that Moses comes down from the mountain, and something really strange has happened to Moses, right? He doesn't look like he did before. Moses doesn't even know that this is happening. I don't know how you couldn't tell that your face is shining. I guess they maybe didn't have a lot of mirrors back then. But his face is shining, right? He has been in the presence of God's glory, and he came away reflecting it, right? Shining so brightly that it actually says that the people were afraid to come before him because they're like, whoa, something's going on here with this guy. Something is different than it was before. Moses' face is shining. So Moses has to put this veil over his face that he talks about here in Exodus 34. What's interesting is that this is not the only place that this story of Moses' face shining is brought up. Paul actually references this in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. In 2 Corinthians 3, verses 7 and 8, Paul says, "Now if the ministry of death, this old covenant, was carved in letters on stone and came with such a glory that the Israelites could not gaze at Moses' face because of its glory, which was being brought to an end, will not the ministry of the Spirit have even more glory?" Basically, what Paul is telling us here is that if this much glory came from the old covenant, from the law that was carved on stone, if even it made a man's face shine, right, like we just read about that Moses' face shone, how much more glory then belongs to us, who carry not tablets of stone, but the Spirit of God that is living within us, right? Moses got that glory, right? He experienced God's glory and presence in a way that was so powerful and amazing that it made his face shine. But that wasn't something that lasted, right? Eventually that shine faded. We, on the other hand, have the Spirit of God within us. We have it inside. We have it permanently, as long as we remain connected to the vine. And Paul says that our glory doesn't fade, but rather it's going to grow. Paul goes on to say in verse 18 of 2 Corinthians chapter 3, "And we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another." If we stay connected to Christ, beholding his glory, then what God promises us here in his word is that we are going to be changed into his image, degree by degree. It might be a slow process, right? It might take our entire lives. But as long as we stay connected to the vine, this is what is happening within us. And that change is something that is going to become visible, right? Again, I don't think in the same way that it did for Moses, where our faces are literally shining. We have to put a veil over our face. I think that the way that this change becomes visible for us is in the fruit that we bear, like we've talked about this morning. The fruit that grows out of your connection to Jesus, that is how you image God to the world. That is how you reflect the glory of God. When people see his character in your fruit, in the way that you live your life, in the way that you live and act, God is glorified by that. And that is exactly what Jesus told us at the very beginning. He says, "By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit." Again, that fruit was never for us. It's not to make us look impressive. It's not to make us look glorious. It's not to so people look at us and say, "Look at how much he's shining." The point is that we are a mirror, and we are just reflecting back to the one who gave us that glory in the first place. I don't know about you, but I often, not often, always, find myself falling short of this, right? Of this great responsibility to accurately reflect God's glory. This is a high calling, right? This is an amazing task and responsibility that God has given us here. The mirror of my heart is often dirty and broken and still full of sin. But I like to think that's why the promise that John gives in one of his epistles should be really comforting to us. In 1 John 3 and verse 2, John says, "When he appears, we shall be like him, because we shall see him as he is." You know, Moses only ever saw God's back, right? He just saw a very slim portion. And we have an even greater degree of being able to see God now, right? But even now, we see God as just in a mirror, right? We are just able to reflect his glory out into this world. And hopefully, slowly, our lives are becoming more and more like him, like this transformation that Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians. But one day, we're going to see him face to face. And in that moment, the mirror of our hearts, the mirror of our lives, is going to be something that is perfectly clean, perfectly flawless. We will finally and completely be like him, and we shall see him as he is, in all of his perfect glory that we so imperfectly try to reflect here on this earth. So here's the question that I want to leave you with this morning. If you take a good, hard look at your life and the fruit that is being produced in your life right now, is it reflecting God's glory? Even now, even in the here and now, even though we are not ever going to be perfectly like him on this earth, even in the here and now, are you starting to look less like the world and more like God? Because reflecting God's glory is not just a nice thing that we do if you're a really good Christian. This is what each and every one of us was made for. This is what we were created for. We were made to be joined to Jesus as the one true vine, as Jesus talks about here in John 15, bearing fruit that reflects his glory until that day when we see him face to face and we become perfectly like him. If you're here today and you realize that your life is not perfectly reflecting God's glory in some way, I think all of us could probably put our hand up and say that that's us right now, that has been us. But this group of believers here, we are a group of believers that are trying to more perfectly reflect God's glory in our lives, to be changed, to be transformed, to become more and more like him, to become like this great image that God has laid out for us here. I hope that if you realize that you are lacking in some way, that your life is not accurately reflecting God's glory like he created us to, I hope that you'll come and talk to me. I hope you'll come and talk to someone else that you know. Because this is our purpose, right? This is the whole reason that God created us. And this is what we're here to encourage each other in. I hope that these things have been encouraging and challenging. Let's go to God in prayer, and then we'll have another song. God, we are so thankful and honored that you chose to reveal your glory to us in Jesus and through your word. God, this is such a humbling task that you have put before us, to be your image bearers in this world, to be people who are meant to reflect your glory. And God, oftentimes we don't feel up to the task. We fail so often in that. But Father, I just pray that through the normal, everyday things that we do, the way that we live our life, the fruit that is being produced in our lives, that more and more every day that we will try to reflect your glory, to come back to the purpose that you created us for. Father, I pray that as we do this, that you will continue to transform our hearts, that you will make us more and more into the image that you would have us to be. For Father, we just want to glorify you. We want to give you glory. And I pray that you will continue to show yourself to us and to help us to glorify you more and more every day. Lord, let the fruit that we bear in our lives be something that gives you glory, like Jesus has promised us here in John 15. And I pray that as we do that, that the world will see not that we are impressive, not that we are anything great, but just that we are your disciples. We are your followers, people who are trying to give you glory. I pray this all in and through the name of Jesus, your glory. Amen.